The day the Xylatrians arrived on Earth changed history forever. Their arrival wasn't marked by war or conquest, nor were they benevolent saviors descending from the heavens. They came as survivors, a species forced to flee their dying home. Zereth 4, their once thriving planet, had suffered a cataclysmic disaster that rendered it uninhabitable, and Earth was their last hope. Unlike the monstrous depictions of aliens in human folklore, the Xylatrians were elegant, almost ethereal. Their bioluminescent skin shimmered like liquid silver under sunlight, shifting colors in response to their emotions. Their hands bore only 4 fingers, long and dexterous, their limbs slightly elongated, giving them a graceful, flowing movement. Yet despite their otherworldly appearance, their intelligence and emotions were undeniable. Humans, wary yet curious, had agreed to give the refugees a designated settlement, a region isolated from major cities where they could acclimate to Earth's atmosphere, culture, and society without overwhelming either species. Scientists, diplomats, and researchers flocked to the Xylatrians' temporary cities, eager to learn from them. But for most humans, daily life remained unchanged, their interactions with the extraterrestrials limited to news broadcasts and speculative conversations. For Sorian, the arrival of the Xylatrians was an interesting phenomenon, but it did not impact his life directly. He preferred the quiet life, away from the bustling cities and their chaotic noise. His home, a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of one of the human Xylatri border towns, had been in his family for generations. He spent his days tending to his greenhouse, repairing old machinery, and working on small engineering projects for nearby farmers. It was a simple life, and he was content. He had no grand ambitions beyond the land he worked and the solitude he cherished. He hadn't expected to meet one of them in person, let alone under such unusual circumstances. It was a late afternoon when he first saw her. The sky was a muted orange, the air thick with the scent of soil and fresh crops. Sorian was harvesting a batch of lunaberry pods, a fruit he had carefully cultivated in his greenhouse. The small, round berries glowed faintly under the dimming light, their flavor a perfect mix of tart and sweet. He had been so focused on gathering them that he hadn't noticed the presence behind him until a soft voice, layered with reverberating tones, spoke. "I do not recognize this flora." Sorian turned sharply, his muscles tensing instinctively. A few feet away stood one of them, a Xylatri woman, her skin shimmering with faint iridescent hues of blue and violet. She was slender, taller than most human women, her elongated limbs giving her an almost ghostly elegance. The patterns on her cheeks pulsed gently, as if reacting to his presence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sorian had seen images of Xylatrians before, but standing this close to one was different. Her eyes, large and multifaceted like polished amethyst, reflected the evening light in a mesmerizing way. She regarded him with curiosity, her head tilting slightly to the side. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "It's a fruit," he explained, lifting the basket slightly. "Safe to eat." The Xylatri woman took a step closer, her movements precise and fluid. "You cultivate these?" Sorian nodded. "Been growing them for a while now. Humans eat them fresh or use them in food." He hesitated before offering one, holding it in both hands as a polite gesture. "Want to try?" She studied him for a moment, then reached out, not with her fingers, but by pressing the fruit against the inner part of her wrist. What happened next left Sorian stunned. The lunaberry pulsed faintly before dissolving into her skin, absorbed directly into her bloodstream. Sorian blinked. "That's not how we eat." The Xylatri woman's bioluminescence flickered sharply, shifting into a deep shade of sapphire. Her expression, unreadable moments ago, now held unmistakable shock. She took a step back, her fingers trembling. "You?" She exhaled slowly, her voice almost unsteady. "You have just initiated a Mazak." Sorian frowned. "A what now?" She stared at him, as if trying to determine whether he was joking. When she realized he was genuinely confused, her gaze softened, but the tension in her stance did not. "Among my people, food is not exchanged carelessly. The act of offering nourishment, especially with both hands, is an ancient practice reserved for deep trust and unity. If one accepts it in the traditional manner. Her voice trailed off before she took another breath. It is a ritual of bonding. You have unknowingly proposed a sacred union. Sorian felt his stomach drop. Wait, you're saying, you think I just asked you to marry me? The Zealotry woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she observed him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Finally, she spoke. Not think. You did. A sharp, awkward silence stretched between them. The only sound was the distant chirping of insects and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Sorian tried to process her words, but they felt unreal, absurd. Marriage? From a simple offer of food? That's gotta be a misunderstanding, he said, running a hand through his hair. I didn't mean. The intent matters little, she interrupted gently, though there was a heaviness in her voice. The act was witnessed by me, and I responded accordingly. In my culture, breaking a Mazak is not impossible, but it carries shame. Not just for me, but for you as well. Sorian let out a slow, frustrated exhale. So what? If I don't go through with this, I'm some kind of dishonorable man. She hesitated before nodding. Yes, he groaned, rubbing his temples. This was absurd. He had never even considered marriage with a human woman, let alone an alien with a completely different set of customs. And yet, the sincerity in her gaze told him that this was not a joke or a test. She genuinely believed that they were now bonded. After a moment, he sighed. What's your name? The Zealotry woman straightened slightly, her bioluminescence shifting to a more neutral hue. Vilithe. Sorian, he replied. He exhaled again, slower this time. So, Vilithe, what do we do now? She studied him for a long moment, as if measuring his character. A Mazak does not require immediate permanence. Among my people, there is a period of adjustment, a trial where the bond is tested. If after that time both individuals agree, the union is solidified. If not, there are ways to dissolve it, though the consequences remain. Sorian crossed his arms. How long is this trial? 30 rotations of your planet. A month. Vilithe nodded. A month. That didn't sound so bad. Maybe he could endure it, go through the motions, and then politely step away without causing too much trouble. He had gotten himself into this by accident, but if there was a way out that didn't ruin both their reputations, it was worth considering. All right, he said reluctantly. 1 month. Vilithe studied him for another moment before giving a small, slow nod. Then it is decided. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky into shades of deep crimson and violet, Sorian found himself staring at the woman before him, realizing that his life had just taken a turn he could have never predicted. He had no idea what he had just agreed to, but something told him that whatever happened next, it would change everything. Sorian had always believed that life followed a simple rhythm. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, and repeat. But now, with an alien woman living under his roof, bound to him by a misunderstanding of traditions, that rhythm had been completely shattered. Vilithe moved into his farmhouse the day after their encounter. She arrived without hesitation, carrying only a small case filled with what he assumed were personal belongings. When she stepped through his doorway, she examined her new surroundings with quiet curiosity, her fingers trailing lightly along the wooden frame of the entrance. The materials are organic, she noted, her tone contemplative. It's wood, Sorian said, watching her carefully. Pretty common in human homes. Vilithe tilted her head slightly. It is alive? Not anymore. Her bioluminescence flickered faintly, shifting into a shade of soft lavender. A color Sorian had begun associating with contemplation. He had learned quickly that the Xylatrians communicated through more than just words. Their skin pulsed with colors, their hums carried layers of meaning, and the way they moved spoke volumes. Understanding her was like trying to decipher a language that had no direct translation. She walked further into the house, her movements precise and deliberate. Sorian had expected her to be hesitant, but she adapted quickly, moving with an almost eerie grace as she explored. When she reached the kitchen, she paused by the counter, her fingers hovering over a bowl of fruit. "You prepare sustenance here?" she asked. "Yeah," Sorian said, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorway. "That's where I cook." Vilathay studied the assortment of apples and oranges in the bowl. "I wish to learn." He raised an eyebrow. "You don't even eat like we do." "That does not mean I cannot understand the process." Sorian wasn't sure why that surprised him. She had been inquisitive since the moment they met, her fascination with human customs evident. Maybe this was part of her way of adapting. With a shrug, he reached for a knife and an apple, slicing it into even sections. Vilathay watched intently, her glowing eyes never leaving his hands. "You use tools to alter the shape and texture of food," she observed. "That's one way to put it," Sorian said with a smirk. "It also makes it easier to eat." He picked up a slice and took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "I guess this whole process is weird to you, huh?" Vilathay didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another slice of the apple and, just as she had with the lunaberry, pressed it against her wrist. The fruit glowed faintly before being absorbed into her skin. Sorian couldn't help but stare. "You really don't have taste buds, do you?" Vilathay hummed softly. "Not in the way humans do." He shook his head, amused despite himself. "Well, you're not missing much. It's just an apple." "Just an apple," she repeated, as if committing the phrase to memory. As the days passed, their strange arrangement settled into something almost resembling normalcy. Vilathay adapted quickly to life on Earth, though she found certain aspects of human existence perplexing. She spent hours watching Sorian work, asking endless questions about the mechanics of his greenhouse, the structure of his home, the way human technology functioned. She had an analytical mind, always processing, always observing. Sorian, in turn, found himself growing used to her presence. He had expected awkwardness, but Vilathay was not intrusive. She respected his space, moved through his home with quiet grace, and never demanded anything from him. In some ways, it was easier than he thought it would be. But there were still moments of tension. One evening, as they sat outside beneath the vast, starlit sky, Sorian found himself watching her out of the corner of his eye. She was seated with her legs folded beneath her, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her bioluminescence pulsed faintly, a slow, steady rhythm of shifting hues. After a moment, she spoke. "Do you regret this bond?" Sorian exhaled slowly, leaning back against the wooden steps of the porch. "I don't know if regret is the right word," he admitted. "I didn't exactly plan on getting married, especially not like this." Vilathay turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Among my people, Mazak is not merely a legal agreement. It is a connection of trust, a union of understanding." Sorian rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, humans don't exactly have a glowing tradition of arranged marriages. Most of us marry because we want to. Do you wish to end this arrangement?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Sorian hesitated. It would have been easy to say yes. Easy to tell her that they should find a way to break the bond and go their separate ways. But the truth was, he didn't mind her being here. It was strange, certainly, unorthodox. But Vilathay wasn't a burden. She didn't disrupt his life the way he had feared she would. In fact, in some ways, her presence had made things interesting. "I don't know," he finally said, "but I don't hate having you around." Vilathay was silent for a moment before her glow softened to a pale lavender. Sorian had seen that color before. It was the same shade she had displayed when she first entered his home, when she observed his kitchen, when she asked to learn about human customs. A color of quiet contentment. Their tentative understanding continued to grow in small, unexpected ways. Vilathay had taken to helping him with the greenhouse, though she lacked the need for sustenance in the human sense. She found joy in the work itself, fascinated by the process of nurturing something from the soil. One afternoon, she knelt beside a row of sprouting vegetables, her fingers gently brushing against the leaves. Sorian watched her from a distance, noting the way her bioluminescence pulsed in rhythm with her breathing. "You like it, don't you?" he asked. Vilathe looked up, tilting her head. "The act of creation is fulfilling. Life is fragile, yet it thrives." Sorian smirked. "You sound like a poet." She blinked at him. "Is that a compliment?" He chuckled. "Yeah, I guess it is." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and violet, Sorian realized something he had not expected. He was beginning to enjoy her company. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. A connection, however fragile. And for the first time since this whole mess started, he wasn't so sure he wanted to break it. "You said." The wind carried the scent of damp earth as Sorian knelt by the greenhouse, hands deep in the soil. The air was crisp, charged with the aftertaste of a recent rain, and the quiet hum of insects filled the evening. He worked methodically, fingers pressing seeds into the ground, but his focus wavered. Vilathe was watching him again. She wasn't intrusive about it, never had been. She observed with a quiet patience, her bioluminescence shifting in slow waves of soft silver and pale indigo. Sorian had long given up trying to interpret every fluctuation of her glowing skin, but he knew those colors now. They meant she was thinking, processing. "You don't have to just stand there, you know," he said, glancing up at her. Vilathe tilted her head. "I do not wish to interfere." He smirked. "Then help instead." He patted the ground beside him. "You wanted to understand human customs, right? Well, here's a pretty basic one. Gardening." She hesitated before gracefully lowering herself beside him, her elongated fingers tracing the soil with careful precision. She watched him dig another small hole, her glowing eyes studying the movement of his hands before she mimicked the action. Sorian nodded approvingly. "Not bad." Her fingers brushed against his as she pressed a seed into the soil. A faint, unfamiliar sensation passed through him. Something like static, a tingling warmth that faded as quickly as it came. He looked up at her, but she didn't react, continuing her task as if nothing had happened. Sorian exhaled slowly. He was getting used to her presence. More than that, he found himself seeking it. Their tentative partnership, once an awkward misunderstanding, had shifted into something more natural. She asked questions, he answered. She observed, he guided. What had started as an obligation was turning into something else. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. That night, they sat on the porch together, a quiet understanding between them. Sorian sipped a mug of tea while Vilathe watched the stars, her bioluminescence flickering with the soft rhythm of her breathing. "This planet is strange," she murmured. He raised an eyebrow. "That so?" Vilathe nodded. "There is a depth to it. Life here does not merely exist. It fights, it adapts, it thrives in ways I have never seen." Her fingers curled slightly. "Your people are the same." Sorian huffed a quiet laugh. "You say that like it's a good thing." "It is." She turned her gaze to him. "Humans endure. Even when faced with the unfamiliar, you find ways to coexist with it." Sorian met her eyes, something stirring in his chest. He wasn't sure what to say to that. Instead, he found himself studying her features, the delicate, almost translucent glow of her skin, the way her bioluminescence reflected the faint moonlight. She was unlike anything he had ever known, yet somehow, the sight of her sitting beside him felt right. Vilathe tilted her head slightly. "Your expression has changed." He blinked. "Huh. You were looking at me?" she said softly, her voice laced with quiet curiosity. "But not in the way you usually do." Heat crept up Sorian's neck. He hadn't even realized it. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his head. "I guess I was just thinking." Vilathe's glow deepened to a faint shade of violet. "About?" Sorian hesitated, then shook his head with a smirk. "Nothing important." She studied him for a long moment before nodding, but something in her gaze lingered, a silent understanding. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was comfortable, filled with the quiet sounds of the night. It was Vilathe who finally broke it. "Among my people," she began, "there is a belief that true connection is not bound by time or tradition. It is found in the spaces between words, in the moments where two beings understand each other without speaking." She looked at him then, her gaze steady. "Do you believe that?" Sorian swallowed. He had never thought about it in those terms. Relationships, in his mind, had always been a thing of logic. You met someone, you connected, and if things worked out, you built a life together. But with Vilathe, nothing had followed a predictable pattern. And yet, she was still here. "I don't know," he admitted. "But maybe I'm starting to." Her glow pulsed faintly, and for the first time since they met, Sorian thought he understood the meaning behind it without needing to ask. The wind was gentle as it rustled through the greenhouse, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh crops. The night sky stretched infinitely above them, a canvas of stars scattered across the darkness. Sorian leaned against the wooden railing of the porch, arms crossed, watching Vilathe as she stood a few feet away, gazing at the sky. Her bioluminescence flickered in slow, deliberate pulses, a soft blend of deep indigo and faint silver. Tomorrow would mark the 30th day, the end of the Mazak trial. He should have felt relieved. That had been the plan, hadn't it? Endure the month, go through the motions, and then part ways without unnecessary complications. That was what he told himself in the beginning. So why did the thought of her leaving feel so wrong? Vilathe turned her gaze to him, studying him in that quiet way of hers. "You are troubled." Sorian exhaled slowly. "Guess you could say that." She stepped closer, the glow of her skin casting faint patterns across the wooden floor. "The trial ends soon." He nodded, gripping the railing a little tighter. "Yeah." There was a pause. Vilathe's glow softened, the pulsing rhythm slower than before. "Do you wish to dissolve the bond?" The words sat heavy in the air between them. Sorian opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. His own hesitation startled him. He had spent weeks convincing himself that this was temporary, that once it was over, things would go back to how they were before. But now, standing here with her, he realized something he hadn't dared to acknowledge. He didn't want things to go back. He didn't want her to leave. Sorian ran a hand through his hair, inhaling sharply. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than he expected. Vilathe studied him for a long moment. Then, with a grace that was uniquely hers, she stepped closer. So close that he could see the faint shimmer of her skin, the way her glowing eyes reflected the light of the stars. "I have come to value our time together," she said, her voice soft. "Your world, your customs, they are strange, yet fascinating. And you—" She hesitated, then continued. "You have shown me kindness where none was required." Sorian swallowed. "So what does that mean?" Her bioluminescence pulsed, shifting into a color he had never seen before. A shade of deep violet, touched with streaks of silver. "It means I do not wish to leave." Something inside him loosened, as if he had been holding his breath for far too long. He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You know, I thought this whole thing was a mistake. That it was just some weird misunderstanding that I had to deal with." He exhaled. "But now, I don't think I can imagine this place without you in it." Vilathe's fingers twitched slightly, a subtle gesture, but one that did not go unnoticed. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out, her fingertips grazing his wrist. The touch was light, almost hesitant. But beneath it, Sorian felt something, warmth, energy, something deeper than words. His heart thumped hard against his chest. "If we do this," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "it's not just for the sake of tradition. It's because we want it." Vilathe met his gaze, her glow steady. "Yes." Sorian took a slow breath. Then, without overthinking it, he turned his hand over, fingers brushing against hers. She did not pull away. Instead, her glow deepened, wrapping them both in its soft light. A silent answer, quiet promise. Sorian smiled. "Then let's do this the right way." And as the night stretched on, beneath a sky filled with endless stars, they stood together, not as strangers bound by mistake, but as something far more real.